Gesture recognition is a fantastic mechanic to add to any VR project. From the developer's point of view, it is a great way to add in more functionality without having to sacrifice any of the buttons from your controller or grip or anything like that. And from the player's perspective, it's a great way to embody the character that they are playing as, whether it be a mage casting a massive spell or some interdimensional being hurtling through time and space. It is fantastic for just about any VR project. And thanks to the VR expansion plugin, it is also incredibly easy to implement into any VR project. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to not only recognize gestures, but also how to record them. So that way you can add VR gestures into your project. So let's go and jump right into it. All right, so I've gone ahead and opened up a new level. As usual, I'm not going to go through, creating a new level or anything like that, but I've gone ahead and opened up a new level, completely clean. I've also gone ahead and removed the player start, and I've imported the VR expansion plugin as well as the OpenVR expansion plugin. And I actually want to go over here as well into project settings, into our action mappings. And I want to actually set up two quick action mappings. The first one is going to be gesture left. And I also want to set up one for gesture right. So in order for this to work, what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to set this up so that way when we press the button, it will, depending on what we're doing, we're either going to record or we're going to bind the gesture. And I'll get into that in just 1 second. Now I'm using an index, so I just want to keep it simple. I believe I'm just going to use the A button on both of my controllers since that's just kind of simple. It makes it nice and easy to work with. So let's go and do this. Valve index left A press and Valve index, and I actually need right A press. There we go. Now, of course, if you want to set it up with different controllers or multiple controllers, you can come here and add in more buttons or different buttons or whatever the case may be. This is just something I'm going to be using just for demonstration purposes. Now, jumping over here, before we actually get into creating our character and attaching the gesture recognition component and all that, I'm actually going to create a data asset. This is where we're actually going to record our gestures. So if we actually go ahead, you can see I've created a folder here for our data assets, and I'm actually going to go, I believe it's in miscellaneous. Yes, it is. So when we click on data asset, you can see we actually get a list of a whole bunch of different data assets that we can use. The one I'm concerned with is the gestures database. And I'm actually going to create two of these, one for each hand. Now you shouldn't have to do this. If you want to have the same exact gestures for both hands, it should be possible to actually set up one data asset and then use it for both hands. But I'm going to set up one for each hand so that way we can have different gestures for each hand. So I'm going to go ahead, we'll do gestures left hand, and let me go ahead and duplicate this real quick. Gestures right hand. And there's nothing really too special about these, but I do want to go and open these up real quick just so I can break down how this works. And actually I only need one open, I just want to make sure those are both saved. So you can see that here in our data asset, it's pretty simple for the most part. When we create a gesture, you can see we can have, of course, as many as we want. Let me go and trash those. And if we go and create one, this is the way that it is set up. So you can see that each data asset will have, or each gesture will have a name to identify what the gesture is, as well as a gesture type. And then samples is something we can't modify. This is the reason we actually need to record in the first place. And then we have all these other various elements that we can't modify gesture size, but we can modify the minimum gesture length, the threshold, all this kind of stuff. Mirror, I believe it is the point where you want to come to if you want to be able to mirror it between your hands. That's entirely up to you. The part that I'm most concerned with, though, is right up here, the name and the gesture type. This is how we actually go about detecting gestures. Now, when we actually detect gestures, there's a couple of different ways we can actually get what type of gesture we're using. One is going to be through the name. However, something that I found when working with gestures is that having multiple of the same exact gesture will improve the accuracy. So what I typically do is I'll give all the gestures roughly the same name. At the very most, maybe I'll name them like circle 0, circle 1, circle 2, so on and so forth. And then what I'll do is I'll actually go into gesture type and I'll actually change this. That way corresponding gestures that are meant to do the same thing will actually all return the same gesture type. Now you don't have to do this if you don't need that much accuracy, or maybe you just want to label them all the same name, that would work as well. But that is one option that I found works best for me. All right, now with that out of the way, we can actually close that for a second. And I'm actually gonna go over to here. Now we should be able to use this in the pawn that comes in the VR expansion plugin. However, since we're using the VR expansion plugin, I'm actually going to go and set up a VR player real quick. And we're going to go and create a blueprint class, VR character. There we go. And I'm just going to call this player. And let me go and drop this into the world real quick, so that way we don't have to worry about this later on. And let me also there we go. Auto possess player and auto receive input. Okay, pretty simple so far. All right, so going ahead and opening up our player, it's pretty standard stuff for the VR expansion plugin. Now the point that we're actually going to want to, of course, track gestures on is going to be our hand, since it doesn't really make sense to track it on our head or anywhere in our chest area or anything like that. So we're actually going to track it on our left and our right motion controllers. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to add components to both of these. And if I recall, it's just called VR gesture. Yes, it is. And I'm going to call this one VR gesture left. And let me go ahead and duplicate this real quick. VR gesture. I'm going to call this one right. And I'm going to transfer this one over to our right hand. Now it's going to be basically the same setup for both hands. So first off, we're going to see over here our gestures DB. This is the database we created. So whatever database we want to have our gestures stored in and then later on reference from, that's where we want to come from. So I'm going to quickly go and assign those real quick. Gesture right hand. So fairly simple stuff so far. Now this is where it gets kind of optional. There are alternatives, of course, to this, but right here with the spline meshes. So I'm not going to have anything attached to the hands to show where they are, just for simplicity's sake. I'm only going to have the gestures set up, but this gives us an option to actually see what gesture we're currently drawing. So an option that we have when we actually draw our gestures, or when we create a gesture that we want to recognize, is we can actually have it draw a spline mesh. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use beam mesh for our spline mesh, and I believe there's actually material that's actually meant to come with this. I can never remember what it's called though, so let me see here. It should be somewhere around here. I believe it's near the bottom actually. And mark endpoint, that's not it. Where is it? Now, quite frankly, you don't have to use this specific mesh or this specific material. I'll go and use this one. Oh, that actually is the one that we're meant to use. Okay. And then again, beam mesh, and what was it called? Spline arc material. Spline arc mat. All right, so again, this is optional and you can use different meshes or anything like this. This is simply meant to draw a spline for us to work with, so that way we can actually see the gesture we're drawing as we're drawing it. It makes it a little bit easier to tell what we're doing. This isn't necessary. This is something we can disable, and I'll get into that in a second. And we can also use a different spline mesh if you'd prefer. All right, but with that out of the way, next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to go and jump into our event graph. Here in our event graph, things aren't totally complicated in order to actually get our gestures working, but there is a very simple step that we're going to go through in order to determine whether we're recording or whether we are recognizing, and then I'll show you guys how to also go about recognizing things, or recognizing the gestures. So I'm actually going to get rid of all these because we're not going to be using any of these. And let me go ahead. So first off, let's grab our inputs. So we're going to be using gesture left and gesture right. So gesture left and gesture right. Pretty simple so far. Now, we're also going to want to grab our VR gestures for both of these. And I'm actually just going to set up one of these at a time, but this will make sure we have everything in place for when we go to the other hand. All right, so what we want to do is actually, before we do anything else, let's go and create also a variable. And we're going to call this is recording. And I'm actually going to set this to true so we're going to use this Boolean to determine whether we're currently recording or whether we're recognizing the gesture. Now, this is completely optional. If you want, you can do both. Although I don't really see why you'd want to. That doesn't really make much sense. But that is certainly an option as well. And so by saying this to true, what we're going to do is I'm going to run through this 2 times. First time we're going to run through with is recording true, so that way we can record our gestures. And then we're going to run through actually detecting those same gestures. So with this in mind, let's go ahead, and we're also going to need this for both of them actually. So is recording. All right. So first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to begin recording. And this is what we actually do to start our recording, which is pretty self-explanatory. Now you can see right here we have options to determine whether or not we're running detection, which is where our is recording is going to come through. I'm actually going to run this through a not, and then I'm going to run this through run detection. Let me actually clean this up a little bit too, so we can make this look a little bit neater. So what happens is when we're running through detection, actually I'll come back to this in a second because there's actually a second part to that, which I will get into in a second. But we do want to look at the rest of these. So I am going to check off, so we're drawing a spline. Sampling HTC, all this stuff can pretty much remain the same. Flatten gesture is kind of up to you. Along with draw gesture, these are both kind of up to you. I'm not going to go too much into these. Flatten gestures essentially does what it claims it does. It flattens the gesture when you're drawing it. So that's entirely up to you. You don't have to do that. It allows, if you decide not to flatten it, you can actually do more of a 3D, so forward and back rather than just a 2D thing that you see. But that's entirely up to you. I'm going to leave it flattened just for this example. All right. And the next thing we're going to want to do is we actually want to be able to end our recording. And another thing that is going to be optional is we also want to do save recording. So one step at a time. So on released, we very clearly want to end our recording. However, whether or not we save it is going to depend on if we are in fact recording. So let's go and run this through a branch. And let me actually go and clean this up just a little bit. All right. So if we are in fact recording, then what we want to do is we want to save our recording. Let me go ahead. I'm trying to keep this somewhat simple here. And so we're going to want to pass through our end recording since this contains all the data that we want to save. We also need to give it a name. Well, technically we don't have to, but I'm going to give it a name just so we can be sure that it's recording correctly. And I'm also going to leave it as scale recording to database. You don't have to do this. This is optional. It does it does have the option to scale the gesture, which can allow for more accuracy either in smaller or larger gestures. But that's entirely up to you. And with that, that's pretty much it that we need on the input side. I'm actually going to go ahead and copy all this, and I'm actually going to move this down here. And we can actually use this. Let me see here. Pressed, released, and run both of our is recording, and then all 3 of our VR gesture right. So pretty straightforward so far. This is very basic for our recording. All right, so with this all done, our next step is actually to go through and actually determine what to do once it detects a gesture. So if we actually go ahead and jump over here into VR gesture left, you can actually see down here in events, we have on gesture detected bind. And that's essentially what we use to detect our gestures, is we use these events. And these are only triggered when run detection is true, which is why I have it disabled when we are recording. This is entirely optional. However, I find it kind of pointless to record it and then automatically detect it or anything like that. So rather than have it recorded and then automatically detect it, I've decided to turn off gesture detection when it is recording. You don't have to do this. You shouldn't run into any major issues if you decide to leave run detection true at all times. However, I just find it a little bit simpler that way. Now, going through this is all pretty simple for the most part. The main two things I want to focus on are the gesture type and the gesture name, as these are the two that you're probably going to be most concerned with. So gesture type does quite simply bind to our type. This will basically be whatever type of gesture we have detected. And gesture name, as the name implies, actually binds to the name of our gesture. Now both these, of course, can be used to detect the type of gesture that we're working with. However, as I said, I personally prefer to use gesture type. All right, so it's at this point that we can kind of determine whatever it is we want to do with our gesture. For simple demonstration purposes, I'm just going to print out a string, and actually let me go and append this, because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to detect both our gesture type as well as our gesture name. So let's go and do this. Let's do gesture type, and you can see it automatically converts it to a string, and then I'm actually going to do this. Actually, let's do this. An equal sign, and then we'll run our gesture name. And let me, I highlight too much. There we go. And same thing here. I'm just going to keep this nice and simple. Now, this is clearly not going to do anything mechanic-wise, because that'll be something that kind of varies depending on what it is you want to do. But this will have to really show how it all outputs. And with that, that's pretty much everything that we need. So let me go and make sure everything is saved, and is recording is set to true. And what we'll go and do is we'll go and run through this, and we're going to do two runs. Our first run is going to be is recording. I'll come back into the editor and I'll actually modify these gestures just a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and jump right back in. So it took me a second to get this booted up because I didn't realize my controllers were off, and I thought that there was an issue with the code. Turns out everything was working just fine. It was just my controllers were off. But anyways, so you can't actually see my hands are out here in front of me right now, but there is actually, right now I'm waving my right hand right in front of you. Now if I go ahead and press A, we'll actually see the spline for our gestures. So I'll go and do a circle first. So there's a circle, and I just released A in order to stop the spline. And let me actually do a couple of gestures here. Let's do a circle, and let's do a triangle. Okay, so circle and triangle for the right hand. And you know what, let's just go and do the same thing for the left hand. So this is going to be the left hand now. So circle and triangle. And I'm not aiming for perfection or anything, but that gives us a couple of very simple gestures to work with there. Now, let me go ahead and exit out real quick and go back into the into our editor here. Now, let me go and open up both these data assets real quick, our left and our right hand. There we go. Oh, I accidentally had a spare one here in the left hand. I did not realize that. All right then. But you can see it did record. We have it recorded them both as temp. So let's actually go and do this. Let me go and do circle right hand, and then this one will be triangle right hand. And I'm actually going to also increase this gesture type to 1. And if we also go ahead and jump over into here, circle left hand and triangle left hand. Now I don't expect for this to work perfectly simply because we only have one sample of each. However, because we also don't have so many different gestures, I also expect that I shouldn't have too much difficulty figuring out which is which. The one has very clear angles, the other doesn't, which is why I chose those two. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually gonna turn off is recording right here in our player. And then if we actually go and press play now, there we go. So it should do this. It should basically look the same, where we still have the spline draw out. Hold on. So it should still look the same where we have our spline draw out, but now it should actually print in the top left what gesture we're doing, and it should also clear the spline once it's detected the gesture. So let's go and give this a shot, right? This is my right hand. I'm going to do a circle real quick. And you can actually see it actually stopped, and I actually can't see it in my headset, but it should have printed something in the top left as well. Let me actually do this so that way I can actually see what I'm doing. Yeah, so it did print in the top left. I was looking at the screen to make sure it was actually printing. And if I actually go and do triangle, You can actually see it prints up there in the top left as well. And same thing with the left hand. So here's left hand and left hand. And there we go. So you can actually see it's actually printing things out. Now, of course, what you decide to do with those different gestures and everything is entirely up to you. Here's the thing though, it can prematurely detect gestures, so you do want to keep that in mind. You don't want gestures to look too similar, because if they do, then you actually can run into issues where it might accidentally pick up the one that looks, it might, if you have like maybe like a quarter circle and then you have one that's like a full circle, it might pick up that quarter circle first before picking up the full circle, for example. So you don't want to do something like that. You want to be sure that the gestures are quite different from each other. And like I said before, I found it's best to have multiple samples of the gesture and have them all at a different gesture type, since it does actually allow for you to provide a little bit more accuracy, since it has more gestures to refer to. And yeah, so but with that is a very simple way of recording as well as actually detecting gestures using the VR Expansion plugin. And with that is a very simple way to implement gesture recognition into any VR project that you would like using the VR Expansion plugin. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit the subscribe and the like button down below, and I will see you in the next reality.